Good afternoon, everybody. Warm welcome back to the next part of Metabolism Day. My name is Ken Arnold, and I am Director of Medical Museum, and I'm also heading up the research program 4 here at CBMR. And I think it's a testament to the breadth of vision behind the work that we do at CBMR that our remit is to explore the science and the translation ideas that we've heard about until now in a more social, cultural context. And because we are a museum, we also disseminate the science and our own humanities interests to the general public. And a quick plug, if people haven't been to Medical Museum before, please come and visit us, about a kilometre over there, well worth the trip. But my job this afternoon is to introduce our next speaker. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome Dr. Manon Mathias from Glasgow University. And Manon has a broad set of interests in medical humanities and also the history of medicine, history of science. Her own particular focus is on the overlap between literature and medicine and science in 19th century France. In 2024, she published a book on the gut and the brain and the environment in 19th century French literature. And she will be talking to us today, this afternoon, about the gut in literature and what can what can metabolic researchers gain from fiction? I think it's about time I sat down and passed over to the speaker. Thank you. Big hand for Manon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to Adam Benkard for putting me forward from the Medical Museum, and to Ken and Julene for the very warm welcome. It's a real honour to speak at this event. And this is something I became increasingly aware of when I watched recordings of previous humanities talks given at this conference. Unlike many of those speakers, I'm not a historian of science or a philosopher of science, although I do use historical methods. I'm a literary scholar, so what I'm going to offer you today is a different perspective, I hope, on human digestive health, a literary one. So I think the reason I was invited is that I've worked on the topic of gut health in 19th century France, so I co-edited this volume on the left and then published the monograph a few years ago now. And so my work in this area has mostly been looking at the relationship between the gut and the brain. And given that this relationship is so multifaceted, complex, and still quite mysterious, what I argue throughout my work really is that literature, which is an inherently indeterminate, ambiguous way of thinking about reality, offers a distinctively rich resource in exploring these kinds of mind-body connections. So I'm going to give you some very brief insights into how the gut is described and imagined in literature, and my examples are all from 19th century France. We can talk about why that is maybe later. Apologies if this is obvious, but in literary studies, when we're developing an argument, we don't use data like you do. We provide evidence to support that argument by providing examples from the primary text. So in other words, I have quite a lot of quotations, but don't panic, I'm not going to be testing your French today. I have translated them, it's quite a rough and ready translation into English. So I'll start off with just some examples from various different authors that I think are interesting. I hope you'll find them interesting. And then I'll zoom in towards the end of the talk on a specific gut-based mechanism for disease, which emerged in the later decades of the 19th century. So one example of an author from this period interested in the gut is the hugely prolific and influential realist novelist Honoré de Balzac. Balzac's novels seem to show the gut and brain in contest with each other. In Le Cousin Pons, for example, digestion seems to cause cognitive lethargy. You can see here the digestive process represents this kind of struggle. the vital functions are deployed to such a vast degree that the brain is cancelled out in favour of the second brain. So, and he does use that term. And this leads to kind of inertia of the faculties. So hopefully you're not struggling with this right now after that lunch. But in another one of his novels, the relationship is more ambiguous. When the weakened protagonist of La Peau de Chagrin, or The Wild Ass's Skin, suffers from an unexplained medical condition, one doctor affirms that the intellect has atrophied because the man can no longer digest. Another offers psychological treatment, seeing his mental state as the cause of his gastric problems. All of the doctors, however, note Raphael, this character's disappearance as a human being as a result of his nervogastric ailments. One of them stresses the dilapidation of Raphael's digestive system as something that causes him to lose his identity. So that is the second quotation there. And this comment chimes with the popular expression, when the stomach goes, everything goes, which was still seen as a literal truth by many French physicians throughout the 19th century. So Balzac foregrounds connections between the gut and the brain, and the value also of hygiene-based approaches to the body, but doesn't privilege any one pathway. Now, when I mention hygiene, l'hygiène, I'm referring to the maintenance of health through preventative approaches. And I've got an example here of a hygiene manual. This was a huge area of publication in 19th century France, and I can talk a bit more about that afterwards as well. This is one of the best-selling manuals of that time. And the emphasis in Balzac's novels on hygiene and the importance he places on the gut as, I quote, this organ in which the entire man resides, echoes not only his medical readings, but also the gastronomic writings and literary criticism of the time. To give one example, Brillat-Savarin's best-selling gastronomic text, La physiologie du goût, for instance, which is the source of the famous quotation, tell me what you eat and I'll tell you what you are, affirms that the digestive system affects one's mood, personality type, and even in the case of literary authors, the type of writing, the style of writing. Now, in this period, there's a great deal of interest in the gut in relation to the brain in terms of cognition. Émile Deschanel, in Physiology of Writers and Artists, on the left, argues that an author's diet inevitably affects their mind. And hygiene treatises in France emphasize the centrality of digestion for healthy living, and they're very worried about how this is imperiled by overworking the brain. And the relationship also goes the other way. In earlier periods, health manuals often focused on the scholars' circumstances as the cause of their ailments. And this is true of British publications on the topic as well. But 19th century French hygiene manuals posit that workers of the mind, so thinkers, writers, have a constitutional predisposition to gastric ailments. The psychiatrist Maurice de Fleury in the middle, for example, notes that great minds routinely suffer from weak nerves and stomachs. The author of the text on the right, Physiology and Hygiene of Men Engaged in Labours of the Mind, even affirms that some people evaluated genius based on the state of a person's stomach. And another health manual on men of letters fetishizes the thinker's condition by referring to, I quote, the exquisite sensitivity of the scholarly stomach. Now, at the same time, these kind of texts refer to scholars as somehow above other mortals. So these manuals are founded on a sort of tension between addressing the scholars' problems and ailments and suggesting that scholars are somehow beyond the body. This is something I'll come back to. Digestion was also used as a way of thinking about our status as human beings in relation to animals. This is seen, for example, in the work of George Sand, one of the best-selling authors from this time. One of her characters affirms, as a marker of his move away from savagery towards enlightenment I was no longer the heavy, sleepy animal, wearied by digestion and made stupid by fatigue. Yet, he also reminds us that we need to retain a degree of animal vigour to prevent us from becoming deadened and feeble. So that's the second quotation. So he says that his newly developed nervous system has made me highly sensitive, and this ability to feel the effects of external things was aided by an organic vigour found only in animals or savages, and I was astonished at the weakening of the senses in others. So what he's saying is that the so-called civilized lifestyles of Parisians have caused them to become weak and infirm, in contrast with himself, Bernard. So he doesn't reject the physical realm of digestion, but refuses to be sort of weighed down by it. These kind of reflections also appear in Balzac's work in an after-dinner scene in a short story. The narrator affirms that we have never come across a man who was unhappy while digesting a good dinner. People enjoy staying in this strange state of calm, a form of perfect suspension between the thinker's daydreams and the satisfaction of ruminating animals, which we might call the material melancholy of gastronomy. Digestion, therefore, induces an animal-like state, but it also involves reverie, daydreams. And the crucial term here is ruminer, ruminating, which is used to create a contrast between the animal on the one hand and le penseur, the thinker, on the other. As you can see here, though, the digesting diner is suspended in between the two. These are two sides of the same coin, highlighting our dual status, and la mélancolie matérielle de la gastronomie, that final bit of the quotation, foregrounds this duality, stressing both emotion and matter. So to think a little bit further about this verb, to ruminate, it's defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as to muse, to meditate, to ponder, but also to chew, turn over in the mouth again, and of an animal to chew again food that has been partially digested. So the original Latin term included both the physical and mental meanings. Beyond any metaphorical notion of digestion, then, in Latinate languages, there is a link between thinking and digesting. On the one hand, the process of rumination brings us closer to animals. On the other hand, it separates us from them, since only we humans ruminate in both the mental and physical sense. This term also comes up in other writers' work. For example, the hugely influential novelist Gustave Flaubert. Here is an example from his unfinished novel Bouvard et Pécuchet, where the two protagonists study the digestive system, and they say that to better understand its functions, they regretted not having la faculté de ruminer, the ruminating faculty of these listed physiologists, and they chewed slowly, grinding and salivating, their thoughts accompanying the alimentary bolus through their entrails, following it right to its final destinations with great methodological care and quasi-religious absorption. So this ruminating faculty might be referring to the physiologist's intellectual abilities, but since they carried out experiments on their own gastric juices by re-chewing swallowed food, it more likely refers to their literal ability to break down food, and the rest of the passage focuses on physical digestion. Yet it is said to be accompanied by intellectual and even spiritual ruminations. So Flaubert leaves the link between thought and digestion open. And this openness is something that is distinctive to literature. I want to look at that later. But it also reflects a relative lack of knowledge about the digestive process at this point. Flaubert did a huge amount of reading before all of his novels, and in preparation for this one, he read Experiments on Digestion in the Human Body, and that text explained that it was not known at that point how digestion really works. Now, that was published in 1812, but a popular physiology manual for children, decades later, dedicates the 2 opening chapters to the questions, how do we digest and how does nutrition work? The manual is subtitled Know Thyself. So digestion is still seen as a key part of who you are. And the author notes that chemical developments had led to some progress in the understanding of digestion by this point, so this is the 1870s. But he also highlights remaining mysteries. The way in which we process food and turn this into energy was not fully grasped until well into the 20th century. The digestive process, therefore, although often posited by scholars like historians of the 19th century as a metaphor for mainstream bourgeois norms and an embodiment of middle-class complacency, was actually a very mysterious, intriguing event. Now, if our similarity to animals is due to our reliance on food, then avoiding the need to eat is essential to transcending our material condition. And many perceive the digestive system to be base and lowly, to be rejected altogether. Popular scientist Camille Flammarion, for example, presents a food-free existence in his science fiction novel Uranie, where aliens identify digestion as the cause of humanity's inability to have pure, elevated ideas. And Martians in this novel nourish themselves through breathing, have never digested food. And I think this novel foreshadows H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, in which humanity encounters Martians with highly developed brains and no digestive system. The abhorrence towards the stomach in the century's last quarter was also seen in some branches of medicine, which posited the stomach as an evolutionary remnant no longer necessary to modern humans. Until abdominal surgery took off in the earliest decades of the 20th century, detailed knowledge of the stomach remained vague and open to conjecture. And this lack of knowledge helped foster an air of mystery, revulsion, and also fascination in relation to the digestive area. So what I'm trying to show you so far is that the gut in this period was not just a theme in literature, but a way into thinking about who we are as human beings. And whereas some utopian and science fiction novels feature new beings who bypass digestion, other writers focus quite graphically on the digesting body, especially Émile Zola and Joris Huysmans. One writer and journalist of the time went so far as to define naturalism, which is a movement with which these 2 authors were associated, as the predominance of the digestive and reproductive systems over the mind. But rather than the gut dominating the mind, Zola and Huysmans pursue the consequences of the gut-mind relationship as a 2-way process. The Zolian novel most frequently associated with eating and digesting is Le Ventre de Paris. And Zola wrote that the stomach dominates the action in this text. So he's referring here to the bourgeois stomach symbolized in the middle-class characters and the food markets in Paris and Les Halles. Historian Chris Forth, who spoke at this event a few years ago, observes in his work on 19th century France that in middle-class conceptions of the body in this period, the boundary of self and society cut right through the organism itself, transforming the walls of the digestive tract into yet another surface that required regular maintenance and surveillance. Zola's novel troubles this boundary as the text oscillates between the self as bounded, closed, independent agent who views scenes in the food market from a distance, and a much more unsettling immersion in matter, symbolized by food. There's one early description in the novel which switches between the aesthetic realm, there's a clear sort of frame that is set up, and that there's close attention to tone and color, so basically seeing the scene as a painting, So switch between that and a much more disturbing sense of non-human agency, such as when les légumes s'éveillaient, so the vegetables awoke. And we have lots of examples of these kind of verbs used for food. And these vegetables later become a sea that engulfs the protagonist. Or in a later scene in that novel, there's a so-called symphony of cheeses, in which the conversation that the women are having around these cheeses becomes infected by the cheese's smell. So in these scenes, the separation between the human subject and the rest of the organic world, which is embodied in food, becomes undone. This also operates on a formal level in this novel, since the balance between descriptions, detailed descriptions of material things, especially food, and action and dialogue, mostly the humans, starts to tip towards description, which is undermining the ascendancy of humans. One author who took this paradox further, i.e. an attempt to go beyond the body, and yet a fascinated focus on it, is Huysmans, who's best known now for his novel Arbour, or Against Nature, which is about a man who eschews engagement with the outside world in favour of a life of the mind. But he suffers from persistent gastric troubles, and these keep sort of coming him back down to earth. And he tries to overcome them. So, for example, he drinks bouillon, a kind of broth, echoing late 18th century debates in France on le restaurant, or kind of restorative broth, which was the basis of the restaurant as an establishment. And we can talk more about that later, maybe. And so by breaking down food into a purified liquid, the restaurant liberated the body from the taxing work of digestion. The rejection of the body can be situated within the context of contempt towards the digestive system in the late 19th century that I just alluded to. And this attitude can itself be understood within the broader perspective of a changed relationship with the organic world in the wake of bacteriological understandings of disease. And this takes us to a specific understanding of disease that emerged in the last decade of the 19th century, involving gut bacteria, the theory of auto-intoxication, which will be the basis for the last part of this paper. Now, up to this point, the nature of the relationship between the gut and the brain during the 19th century was broadly nerve-based. But in the 1870s, bacteriologists came to realize that intestinal flora, as they were then called, broke down protein residues in feces into compounds that were highly toxic. And this led to the reasoning that toamines generated in the bowel could be absorbed into the bloodstream, and the theory of intestinal auto-intoxication was born. It took off especially in France. I would argue partly due to the prevalence of gut-based metaphors to talk about the human body and decay. For example, there was a strong associative relationship in French writings between the gut and the sewer. This is demonstrated, for example, in Victor Hugo's Les Misérables, in a section entitled The Bowels of Leviathan. Jean Valjean descends into the sewers, and the narrator asks of the city, what is its intestine? It is its sewer. And this kind of sewer as colon is described in the novel as a space of decay and death. And in a collection of essays from the same time entitled William Shakespeare, Hugo links the digestive tract with decomposition and refers to it as the mother of vices on the right. One sentence from this collection of essays was quoted in an advert from the time for colon therapy. The serpent is within man, it is the intestines. Now, it was the French physician Charles Bouchard who did the most to stimulate research on intestinal microbes in human health and disease. He delivered a lecture at the Paris Faculty of Medicine in 1885, published as the hugely influential Leçons sur les auto-intoxications dans les maladies, and which was published 2 years later. Bouchard explained that humans regularly come into contact with microbes, but the problem occurs when the person's strength is compromised, generally as a result of disordered nutrition, he says, and then some of the microbes can invade the person's body and cause problems from within. And he states that there are poisons in the intestine. They pose a constant threat of intoxication. The gut-sewer pairing takes on particular significance in this theory, since Bouchard describes the colon as a sewer in which the digestive putrefaction begins, resulting in illness. The poisons in the intestine originate in toxic materials which gather in l'égout collecteur, the collecting sewer. Researchers in France at the end of the 19th century were also applying ideas about the role of gut bacteria in health and disease to disorders of the mind. The translator of Bouchard's lecture into English in 1894 noted that recent investigations in this area prove that autointoxication is the cause and not the effect of the mental condition. The researchers themselves were a bit more careful in their wording, but the psychiatrist Maurice de Fleury refers to these ideas in his widely read Introduction to the Medicine of the Mind, here on the left. Physician Lucien Prand also discusses this theory in his book on the right-hand side, The Influence of the Stomach and Diet on Mental State and Psychological Functions. And here he claims that the theory is accepted by everyone. To go back to our novelist Huysmans, he was fascinated by the relationship between the gut and a person's psychological state, and this comes up throughout his novels. But in his later writings, we start to see references to microorganisms in the body. In En Rade, the main character Jacques reads an article about the discovery of thomines, the products formed during the putrefaction of proteins in the human intestine, in dead bodies by Italian scientist Francesco Selmi. And according to the article, when reduced to a concentrated oil, these thomines release pleasant fragrances. Jacques then has a dream, kind of inspired by his reading, and he imagines the commercial use of these substances as a scent, capturing the memory of the dead person. Now, there were widespread fears in the 1880s of thomine poisoning, but Jacques imagines that a thomine dessert might be created out of this liquid extract from the relative's decomposed viscera. Jacques therefore transforms the potentially terrifying prospect of thomines into new creations capable of bringing the dead back to life. And one of the terms used to convey this distillation of the deceased relatives is sublimer. What eternal freshness of memory could not be obtained through these sublime emanations of the dead. The literal meaning of sublimation as a chemical process where things change state is present here, as the thomines are transformed into perfume. But the figurative meaning of sublimer, to purify, to refine, to idealize, is also present here. Rather than leading to harmful poisoning, the thomines lead to a more elevated and pure substance, as Huysmans goes beyond contemporary explorations of bacteria and their toxic impact to present an alternative view of heightened, even purer states. What is distinctive in Huysmans' approach is that he's very much interested in the processes of decay, and at the same time, he begins to explore these in the context of creativity, the imagination, and vitality, as shown in Jacques' dream. In another novel, Là-bas, Huysmans considers the physical origins of mental illness, and a potential link is developed between the mind and microbes in this novel. So the text is interested in the question of possession of the mind and contemporary attempts to explain this in religious terms as demonology or in medical terms as epileptic hysteria. But throughout the text, the experience is linked with possession of a more organic kind. For example, one character asks in relation to hallucinations, spaces inhabited by microbes, is it any more surprising that this should also be teeming with spirits and ghosts? And I've given you the French quotation at the bottom because you can see the French term is larve, which Huysmans pairs with the term microbe, which had been coined fairly recently in the late 70s. So he coins microbe with larve, which carries an old meaning of a ghost, but also makes us think of larvae. So Huysmans is exploring confluence between organic decay, altered states of mind, and creativity. And in French literature more broadly at this point, there was a real fascination with the abdominal area, le ventre, both as a site of decay and the source of new life. And I can give examples of this later. In Là-bas, the narrator at one point states that the spiritual counsellors of the day phosphore comme des pourritures, so they sort of glow like rot. So before the 20th century, phosphorer referred either to the literal application of phosphorus or the figurative sense of shining very brightly. By the late 19th century, the term had also taken on the meaning of stimulating mental activity. And Huysmans was aware of the fact that phosphorus is key for the production of energy in cells. So in this bizarre quotation where he says that religious figures in the 1890s phosphore, comme des pourritures, Huysmans is sort of suggesting that decay can sort of shine brightly and that it is associated with the powerful use of energy, including mental energy. So what does this tell us? Well, the preoccupation in French literature with dirt and decay provided an ideal context for bacteriology to emerge in the 1860s. But France's fixation with sewers and digestion in relation to putrefaction and poisoning also provided the breeding ground for autointoxication theory. As the theory took an increasingly strong hold within medical and general culture, the role of microorganisms within a person's body became a significant factor in 19th century writers' understanding of what it meant to be a healthy self. And this relationship went both ways, with ideas passing between medical theories and literary texts. In 19th century French novels, rather than an empty metaphor to think about more elevated spheres, such as spirituality, the digestive system and its processes are central to explorations of human beings as spirit and matter, life and decay. Even though 19th century thinkers and writers did not have the same evidence at their disposal that we do today, they were already deeply aware of the importance of digestion as an essential part of the human condition. And I've just put one illustration here from an early gastronomic text where the bookshelf is full of food. So hopefully I've given you some sense of the wide-ranging engagement with the gut in literature from this period. And to address my question, what can fiction offer? I think it enables us to sort of zoom out and ask what it means to be both a thinking and digesting body, and how does the nature of and extent of our understanding of digestion shape our vision of human beings. And the value of literature is that it does not provide answers. It is not conclusive. It does not offer any one meaning. Rather, authors strain beyond the body and attempt to transcend it through cognition, emotion, spirituality, even the literary text itself in some ways. And yet at the same time, what emerges through these writings is that the body, especially the digesting body, is bound up with all these processes. And this is what makes us human. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manon, for a very rich post-lunch rumination. I think we're all very grateful for that. I will look at the audience, and I can see immediately a question here, 2 rows down.
Hi, Manon. Thank you. You spoke about literature and medicine kind of interacting. So in this period, how much do you think literature influenced medicine in that direction?
Yeah, It's difficult to prove definitively, but in the case of Bouchard, for example, we know that he held, most of the major literary works of his time. We have records of his library collection from his home, and by now, everyone has become so specialized, it's hard to remain up to date even on your own area. Whereas then, the publication kind of output was much less, and the sort of boundaries between disciplines were much more porous. So it was possible for people to, read about things, developments beyond their own area. And so I think you can see in Bouchard the kind of metaphors that he's using mirror what we see in novels, that had been published from the 1830s onwards, and he's writing about this in the 1880s. So I think, they were intensely interested, literary people like Flaubert, Balzac, Zola. They were reading about the latest scientific and medical discoveries. They were reading the articles. So they were definitely aware of those kind of developments, and then the scientists themselves would have been reading literature. So it's much more, the relationship is very close at this point, especially in France.
Thank you. We have a question here, and then just to keep you very fit, after that we have the question right on the back row.
Thanks. Did you find any indications in the literature about it matters what you eat in terms of the psychological effects? The reason I'm asking is that I have observed that there's a new discipline called psychofoods. I mean, this is a big European network interested in specific effects of specific foods on your mood, your mind, your cognitive functions, etc., which I find very interesting. So, do you see any roots in the literature about what you eat made matter?
Yes, I mean, we can see that the novelists had read the hygiene manuals that I was referring to, and these manuals, they gave advice on what to do after you've eaten, not to do too much, brain-intensive work after eating, for example. In terms of what exactly to eat, they were not all in agreement, but there were some that said, we should avoid overtaxing the body with stimulants. Meat could lead to, violent behaviour, so there was some discussion of that. Especially for women, so the advice did vary according to a person's age and sex. So women should not have too much red meat, not too much alcohol, other stimulants like coffee. They were very worried about the effects of these, more modern stimulants, as they called them. There was a lot of emphasis on milk and having kind of simple foods like vegetables, especially when you were recovering from illness. And in the late 18th century, there was this kind of obsession with boiling things down to this purified essence. So that's as much as I can say on that point.
Yeah, that sounds delicious, that boiling. Actually, a thought I had was, and then we'll come straight to the question at the back, as you were talking, was, are there foodstuffs that help you do science better, and are there other foodstuffs that help you write and do literature better? But we'll maybe go to the
thinking. Yeah, I don't think they made that distinction essentially. Yeah.
A question at the back, and then another jog over to the right-hand side next.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful paper. I was just wondering whether there are responses from medical writers concerning the artist's slight fascination, or the writers kind of seeing a productive energy in the rot and pathology, and then medical people seeing that as a threat to civilization or the kind of body of society.
Sorry, what do you mean by as a threat?
That would sort of spread disease, a mental disease, perhaps.
Oh, okay, because the sort of the fascination with.
So in a sense, allowing the pathology to be, welcomed in some sense, that would go against medical people trying to rein it in somehow.
Yes. And I mean, there was a great deal of fear around this idea, that particularly this particular type of disease, the explanation for disease that emerged in the later decades of auto-intoxication, because it was something that came from within. And so, yes, it was not something that they welcomed. But I haven't seen any sort of direct evidence that they definitely read them and then incorporated that into their work. It was more to do with the use of metaphors like the sewer, also the laboratory, that comes up quite often, which had a particular sort of resonance given what Pasteur was doing, and taking that kind of research into the lab rather than doing it in the population. And so there was a kind of overlap between laboratory and theatrical spaces, and that is something that you see.
Okay, this might be our last question from over there.
Thank you, Manon, for a wonderful talk and for reminding us that any society and any period will have to think through what it means to have a relationship between mind and gut. And perhaps those things say more about the society than they say about the relationship between mind and the gut. But I wanted to sort of ask you to speculate a little, which is, what do you think those sort of 19th century French authors would make of this moment we're in now, where we have medicinal capacity to influence and manipulate appetite? So that kind of interrelationship between mind and gut on a very basic pharmacological level.
I mean, I think Zola definitely would have been very interested, because he was very much influenced by science and by the scientific method. So I think he would have explored that in his novels. I think Huysmans liked to go beyond what he saw in the science and think more in terms of, he liked to pair unexpected words together. So he would potentially sort of explore these ideas, but I think he would want to go beyond them. Like, he wasn't necessarily interested in manipulating individuals in that sense, but I think they would have been very excited by the sort of the potentials. Yeah.
Okay, that's all we've got time for. Another round of applause, I think, is appropriate.